This is the first in a set of conversations of senior linguists, and today we're talking with Catherine Chvany, and Hedras and I are really pleased to be able to have you here. You're here at the University of Chicago at the Franke Institute, and the Franke Institute is our host today. This is the first, so on our part, we don't really know exactly what we're doing, but we hope to talk to you about your life and your career and ideas in linguistics that you've been passionate about and that you've seen, and that's basically what we want to talk with you about today. And we've got people here who I hope will feel free to kibitz and push us a little bit on ideas or questions you'd like to see pursued a little bit, and probably if they start drinking some wine along with us, they'll do a little bit more, but we'll see.
Loosen our tongues.
Yeah, a little bit. I could say a few words about your background, and maybe I'll just start with a word or two. You were an undergraduate at Radcliffe.
Yes.
And where you majored in linguistics.
Linguistics, yeah. It was called comparative philology in 1946 when I started. And then I was a dropout. I got married, had 3 kids, and returned to college as a junior in 1961. And I didn't remember a thing that I had studied before, but Radcliffe gave me credit, and I continued, and I finished in a glorious way because I did all the homework on time. So and it makes a tremendous difference if you because when I was younger, I would go and have coffee, and I worked in the dramatic club, etc., etc. And then, you can learn anything in 3 days. If there are 3 days between exams, I can do it. And I was an okay student, not brilliant, but I, just barely Dean's List. But then, when I had returned and I had kids, I couldn't afford to get behind, and I did. I had to fulfill the science requirement when I couldn't remember that everything to the 0 power was 1, and or is it? And so I had to do, and I did my homework, and I'd look at the solutions that were posted right after you handed them in. So, and I ended up getting Super A's. And so then I stayed on in graduate school, and those were the good old days of national defense scholarships and so on. I got the way I had an investment in languages and an enjoyment of languages is that my parents, they were refugees from Russia in Paris. But they wanted to be sure that my sister and I be culturally Russian. And so they isolated us from all the French children around us, and we had a Russian. They made tremendous efforts to have the kids of like-minded people play with us on rare occasions, just so we'd fit into the society that no longer exists, or that didn't exist even then. But I guess my father thought the revolution would blow over. And would go
It may yet.
And so, and then we were sent to school at age, I was 7, because I had to wait till my little sister was old enough to go. So we went, and I didn't know a word of French except "pipi, madame," in case that should be necessary. And luckily I didn't need it. But so then I became a native speaker of French between the ages of 7.5 and 13. And then during the war, between the fall of France in June 1940 and Pearl Harbor, 41, through a whole bunch of mysterious chance events, my sister and I were included in a group of children that were taken from France to the United States well, then America wasn't in the war, and they thought, well, we'll fatten these children up, give them vitamins, and then send them back in a couple of years. And we were taken in by this heroic family, and it was great because they had kids who were slightly older than me. They explained all the jokes in the Reader's Digest and even the New Yorker. And so I learned English, and now I'm a native speaker of English. That's my best language. I think I've developed a little bit of an accent from teaching Russian all these years, but that's my best language is now English, because that's where I had my education. And I think my case history calls for a re-examination of all these theories about language acquisition, that your native language is your first language, and that there is a critical period, because it all depends what opportunities you have. For instance, I've coached singers who were preparing for a recital of Russian songs, and they're used to using their mouths as instruments, and they really want to pronounce the words perfectly, and they manage to do it for a small subset. But for an adult, an accent is kind of an advantage. I don't have an accent in French, so people expect me to be smarter than I am in French. See, then they wonder what's wrong with me. I don't know certain obvious things about the culture. And my husband spent some time in a couple of years in Germany as a kid. His father was working there. And so he grew up with a very good German accent. He looked German, and he had a small vocabulary, but if we were traveling, he would ask a question in his beautiful German, and people would answer, geradeaus.
Yeah.
But then if I asked in my PhD exam German, then people answered slowly and nicely and so on. So anyway, that's enough about my life. And then I taught at Wellesley College for a year, sabbatical replacement, and then at MIT for 25 years. I taught I taught Russian, but my research was in syntax. I guess my life spans generations of linguists, because I even took a course in teaching machines from Skinner way back. And then I was also a student, we used Gleason and we used Bloomfield and so on. And then, and I don't think Bloomfield was such a behaviorist. He flirted with the idea, but he wasn't that committed. He was quite a normal linguist, actually. And it was fun to reread some of the things that John has been collecting, some quotations by various linguists who claim that they're scientists. And they all say we're scientists because they are involved with one of the many aspects of science. But I think Bloomfield's quotation was one of the best and most sensible. I was rather surprised about this. And then my other teacher in Slavic was Jacobson, who was a very colorful figure. And then when I went to, and I was thinking of doing my thesis on the Bulgarian verb system, which is very complicated. They have evidentials and so on and so forth. And I thought I would use, say, Jacobson's shifters as a model. But then, as I started to work, I said, this is a syntax problem. It's not a morphology problem, and shifters does not help with this. And then I got the job at MIT, and I audited a course that Hadge was co-teaching with Maurice Halley. And there I was teaching, so I had to leave in the middle of the afternoon lecture and go teach my class and come. So after being a super A student at Harvard, I found myself the C student sitting in the back who had to borrow somebody's notes and so on. But I did learn a lot, and I found that if I have to work with a theory that is new to me, I'd better work in a language that I know better than I know Bulgarian, and where I have access to speakers, including my parents. It gave me something to write to them about. What do you write to your mother in Florida about? But this way, I would say, can you use CBA, the reflexive, in this construction? And what's the difference if you can, and so on. So that was a very nice bonus, and the other thing is that at the very beginning of, the Chomsky so-called revolution, syntactic structures was not felt to be that much of a revolution. In the Slavic world, it's just written up as a continuation of American structuralism. But aspects and Hadge's thesis, that really was a major difference. Syntactic structures turn things upside down. You could look at syntax, whereas before you study the phonemes, you might have a thesis on one phoneme. There's one, the phoneme yach in Slavic, or the suffix nu. And the author of that was Ella Patsaloika. Patsaloika means give me a kiss. And so on the back of her thesis was nu, Patsaloika. She's gone to meet her maker, so I don't think I'm hurting anybody by saying this. Anyway, it was not just that you could do syntax, it gives you permission to do syntax and to look at whole systems. And then there were other just liberating things, like you no longer had to prove that your examples came from an attested corpus. So, it used to be that you'd say, "Vot pero," here is a pen, and you'd have to write, "This occurs in Dostoevsky's The Idiot, chapter such and such." And so that there was this liberation feeling, and I forget, something else brought about some liberation, but now I can't remember what it was.
So you had already discovered linguistics when you were an undergraduate, your second time as an undergraduate. Yes, when I returned the second time it was linguistics.
How did you discover it? What was it that you fell in love with?
I was always interested in language. Like even when I was a little kid, I was interested in word formation and etymologies and stuff like that. Then I studied Latin. I went to Latin school, where I studied Latin and German, and then I took Sanskrit for a term.
At Harvard?
At Harvard, yeah. But then when I decided to get married and leave college, well, it's partly, it wasn't so much that I decided, but my father said, well, you're getting married, you're now your husband's responsibility. And he didn't, well, he was poor, but he didn't want to pay the half tuition that wasn't covered by a scholarship. So,
Who was your first teacher? Do you remember?
Whatmo,
When you were studying, what was it called?
comparative philology.
I
And
see.
so, I thought Professor Whatmo invented the phoneme. It was very, yeah. And then when I came back, I had Kispert and Teeter. Teeter, now one of the things that made me think of all these, the whole generation that worked on recording the native languages. And they would work with the last speaker of, like Teeter did the grammar of the last speaker of Wayat. And some people used to joke, say he finished his thesis and then shot her, so nobody could check. But as you read some of the stuff on heritage learners now, and Lenore's stuff on endangered languages, the last speakers of an endangered language are not really fluent in that language. They haven't had any practice, and their language is very limited. So you don't really get that much of an idea of what the structure of the language is. So maybe what we should do is be extremely diligent about recording our present major languages, because when they disappear, at least we'll have a good trace of them.
Yeah. So, when you came back, had you heard of Jacobson in the meantime, or do you remember?
My parents knew him socially and stuff.
I see.
And there were a lot of anecdotes, but he was quite a character. And then he was the star in the well, he was a star. He made sure he was a star.
So, do you remember the first time you met him?
No.
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 And what was your thesis? Your thesis was with him, right?
No,
Or
no. My thesis was with Lunt, who, I mean, his idea of being a doctor fodder would be, oh, you have a due-to here, or to some other people, not fortunate ones like me, he said, I am not convinced, but it's, well, this is all right, or you have a comma here. But this laissez-faire attitude was just, was great for me. That because Jacobson, for instance, was very possessive about his students. And when Leonard Babby, who became quite a distinguished syntactician at Princeton, he's still there, he had done his master's degree with Jacobson. So Jacobson had decided, okay, I want a critical edition of a certain 18th century grammar done, and Babby's the one to do it. That'll be his thesis. Well, Babby started to go to Hedge's lectures and decided he'd like to do something in generative syntax, which turned out to be the best decision he ever made, because he never would have made much of a career editing Barsov's grammar. And in fact, the person who did do it later has disappeared from view totally. But Jacobson was very angry with Leonard for doing that, and somehow was quietly denigrating. But the interesting thing is about the time that I was starting is that when you start anything, there has to be something to sink your teeth into. somebody make some statement that you can test, that you can disagree with. And Klima had written a review of a book about impersonal sentences. We later reprinted it in the Slavic transformational syntax. And he mentioned, it was a very interesting piece of work, and it showed how the Russians, just for all that they had spilled gallons of ink over impersonal sentences, there were many problems and questions that they hadn't even touched upon. And among the examples that Klima, he made a couple of statements that Russian had auxiliaries. And Russian has maybe one possible candidate, but the verbs for can, may, and so on are ordinary verbs, although they have a lot of irregularities. But they don't form a natural class. There's nothing that they all have in common. All the candidates have in common. The way in English you have negative reduction and various other properties that justify putting them in a different class, though there have been plenty of people who've said that auxiliaries are verbs, right? and in Russian, I said, okay, I'll test it. Are they auxiliaries? That gave me my first chapter. They are verbs, and therefore a study of the deep structures with those verbs is a study of complementation. So mine, it was right after Rosenbaum's complementation, Bob Rothstein, Rosenbaum did in English, Rothstein on Polish, and then I did on Russian, and Comrie did it on Russian from a different point of view in England. And then Babby did the short and long form adjectives, and Roland Sussex did adjectives and relative clauses in Russian and Polish. Wales Brown did relative clauses in Serbo-Croatian. See, the real revolutionary idea was introducing recursion into the rules. Now, there were plenty of times people might have a tree and have the same node labels all over the place, but it's one thing just to say something and another to use it for something important. And this way, okay, this was introduction of recursion, impressive mathematical concept, and so that made a rush to all the recursive complementation, coordination. There was Sasha Andreevsky did a thesis on coordination. Coordination never quite got off the ground, I think, in English either.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
But complementation, some of the issues are still being chewed over with, I think the progress has gotten slow now. When at the beginning of aspects and so on, one of the wonderful things about the requirement of explicitness, and then where did we get our arguments from? From traditional grammars. If the traditional grammar said the reflexive refers to the subject, okay, that's the definition of subject. And then you find, hey, it doesn't all work. So this brought about a tremendous amount of corrections of traditional statements and discoveries of things that, the native grammarians just never noticed or just didn't bother because, their chapter was long enough for lesson 22, and so I think the great appeal of the aspects model was its heuristic power. It helped you discover all kinds of interesting things, and there were always some things to sink your teeth into. And I'm a one-time fellow traveler of history of science, and I took a course in the beginnings of organic chemistry. This was great because we were just told what the properties of these various liquids were, and then had to assign structures from those, and not from some liquid that we had to analyze or decide what the properties were. So that made it easy, but it was, I was struck how doing linguistics at that time, assigning structures to sentences, how similar it was to doing chemistry in the 18th century, where you didn't know for sure what is carbon, what is oxygen, what is hydrogen, is it oxygen or phlogiston? And when we were assigning structures to sentences, we'd say, well, NP. And then you'd have to have a footnote. I believe that there is an NP over this infinitive, even though so-and-so said there isn't, but I have reasons to believe this. And so we had to justify our primitives. Now, you don't have to somehow, there are a lot of things that are given, but the model is losing heuristic power. I don't think there are as many discoveries, partly because there's been a denigration of description. Partly it's because there's been more optimism about explanation, but how do you test the explanation? You test it by see, does it work in all cases, and so on. And as my teacher of history of science, Leonard K. Nash, used to say, he believed that the life and death of history of theories sort of goes along with if a theory loses heuristic power, then it tends to be replaced, even if not even a fraction of its potential has been explored. So, and I think that there were a lot of things that were discovered in many languages during the 50 years since the Chomskyan Revolution. As part of the history of science, it's unheard of that a revolution would continue Trotsky-like for 50 years and all in the same place. But some of it is not exactly revolution, it's just that some people rushed into print too fast, and then they, in some ways you have to rush into print to get a job, but people would rush into print and then find they were wrong, so then they say, well, they write another article correcting their old article. So the first issue of Linguistic Inquiry had a great big article by Postal called Remind. And he had a theory that the verb remind has an underlying structure that says strike as similar. Well, so many people objected that it became the most cited paper for the next 2 years, partly because of prestige of MIT spawned journal. A lot of, Dwight Bollinger answered, a lot of important linguists responded in utter shock and disbelief. And with the best response, somebody who didn't know the article, but it came from like Sunday Comics. One person in the comics said, do I remind you of Billy Eckstein? And the other goes, only when you mention his name. So
one of the problems that you worked on, that the heuristic of generative syntax could lead you in and lead others in, was the question of the underlying position of subjects, of overt subjects in intransitive clauses.
yeah, well, this was the main point of my the book on B sentences, because Russian has genitive in negated sentences, genitive on direct objects, and in some intransitive sort of existential sentences on the subject. And I generalized that both originated as subjects, but that the subject could be promoted into the subject could be promoted, but that there were two sources for intransitive verbs: the object that could be marked with the genitive, and then some did have a subject that could admit a volitional interpretation, like я не буду на вашем концерте, as opposed to меня не будет. See,
What's it mean?
well, я не буду, nominative, I will not be at your concert. That has a volitional connotation, and some books say, the genitive is more polite. Well, the reason it's more polite is that, you see, I'm purposely going to stay away from your concert, as opposed to меня, of me there won't be at the concert. Not my fault. And so again, this is one of those statements from a textbook that it's more polite. But those statements are not right. And what's happened is that now the description, there has been less and less description, that people have to rely on cherry picking a little fact from Icelandic, a little fact from somewhere else, and I've heard people claim that Russian had, there were small clauses in possessive sentences based on lesson 5 of a first-year textbook. Well, those textbooks oversimplified things, or on the notes of missionaries who tried to write down some indigenous language. And we really, I think, need to keep on encouraging some good descriptions. And it's true, you have to have some theoretical framework to have descriptions, but you have to choose the theory in such a way that what you find will survive, even if your theory doesn't.
I have a question. You, at some time, I don't know when it was, maybe it was it in the 70s or 80s, you wrote about a sort of font choice which you expostulated against, and I thought it was very much, I thought it was a permanently valid point. And would you tell, since not everybody here probably knows it, would you tell us the story of that, and what drove you to it? Because you were sort of cross with people, weren't you?
Well, you would read some article and say, I have now I have explained this in italics or underline or something. And this is not merely a description, it's an explanation. And they would insist in this, with this rhetorical device. And so I wrote saying, linguistics has developed a lot, but there still, and there are some predictive rules and so on. But still, you couldn't say that any of the laws that have been discovered recently in linguistics do as well in predicting some phenomena as Boyle's law for the behavior of gases. And that explanation is a constantly receding goal. You may find, oh boy, when I first had my little bit of physics, I thought, this is so exciting. Now I know why the moon stays in its orbit. But then later, somebody might study, say, thermodynamics and find, that takes care of the places where Boyle's law doesn't work. And so I just suggested let's have a convention on the form, a constraint on the form of linguistic description. Stop underlining, explain.
Yeah.
And I submitted it to Linguistic Inquiry because there were lots of, I'm explaining. But they turned it down. I submitted it again. They turned it down again. But then Ted Leitner, who was he was an MIT person, but he taught himself, maybe with the help of Morris Halley. He knew more about Proto-Slavic than any Slavic PhD. He wrote the phonology of Slavic that sort of went back to Indo-European. It was kind of almost an etymology, but he was he was a friend, and he submitted that squib without asking me to this magazine in France called Linguisticae Investigationes, which was probably, you see, LI, a kind of counterpart to Linguistic Inquiry. And then before I know it, I get proofs. And I hadn't, and apparently it had been circulating around, and he sent it to Maurice Gross. And so I said, hey, well, it's okay, but put a little note, because I wasn't the one who submitted it. But one does have to be persistent. The worst anybody can say is no. So don't be afraid to apply, try, submit.
I think that Chomsky and some of the early generativists were very annoyed at Martin Jost and the readings, the collection of readings that he put together in 1957 of structural papers in American structuralist linguistics.
That's where Roland Wells' constituent structure is.
Constituents, yeah.
And between each chapter, Jost has his own obiter dicta about various things in linguistics. And at one point he says, we've grown up now. As a child, we looked for explanations, but now we're grown up and we have to understand that we're not here to look for explanations. We're here to understand things scientifically. And those were fighting words.
Well, I should say, I'd be ready to fight him. I mean, we certainly keep looking for explanations, but we don't brag about how we've explained something. What's affirmed, because the explanation is only as good until the next thesis.
Yeah.
And one of the about the genitive and of negation, that was the origin of the unaccusative. But I did not think of the sexy name. Later I thought of a good name called argative, because some people were calling it ergative, when it's just the opposite of ergative. It's the pattern of ergative languages, but it's essentially the absolutive that they were talking about. And this is one of the unfortunate things about this generative linguistics, is that a very careless use of terms, which makes it very hard to translate. There was a book that I reviewed with Sue Brown on basic trends in American linguistics that appeared in Russia. And John Balin, galloped through a history in 12 pages, going from 1970s ordered rules to minimalism and side trips into a few other things. And he talks about teta teoria. Russian doesn't have these preposed modifiers. And anyway, what's teta? Because at least theta theory has some relation to theme and Greek theta. In Russian, theta is fita, and theme is tema, but it means something different. So it's just these are almost purposely inserted stumbling block, that you're not one of us if you're not using our terms. And they don't care if the Russians do, because see, the only people who are really current are the people who heard what's being said this couple of weeks. But by the time some Russians respond, it'll be 2 years when nobody believes that theory anymore.
Could I ask you, so your thesis was in the linguistics department?
No.
It was in Slavic?
In Slavic, my undergraduate thesis was in the linguistics department. And my graduate thesis was in Slavic, because the Slavic program had a linguistics option but the linguistics was mostly philology.
Okay, so...
and the other is literature.
Okay, so were you attracted at any time, or have you done work taking apart either a poem or some literary text in a Slavic language? Is that something that interested you?
Well, in my collected essays, there are several, and 2 of them originated as papers for Jacobson's courses.
Really?
The poem, The Ship,
Mm-hmm.
I applied Jacobsonian, counting all the verbs and the adjectives and everything else. And so I put that into that student Festschrift of 68, when I think that was my first publication. And then I did another paper on the Igor tale. And that I used, his student, von Sonneveld, had written a book about the system of the Old Russian verb. And Morris used to tell me how, Jacobson used to write wonderful letters of recommendation for people that he approved of. And about von Sonneveld, he said, "Not a day passes that I do not take from the shelf his book." So, I introduced a very slight correction in von Sonneveld's, but essentially, as many papers for Jacobson end up showing that Jacobson is right. And I think in one of those little anecdotes that the Chinese reader asked me to write, I had written a paper for Jacobson. He had suggested the system of the English verb. Well, I worked, because even though Jacobson was a very easy grader, he gave, I think I've seen people cry over a B+ from him because it was, of course today people cry over B+ because of grade inflation, but in those days it was difficult to get an A, except Jacobson you could get an A. But we didn't know this, this famous person. So everybody worked very hard, and they probably deserved this. And I wrote this paper, The System of the English Verb, and he was telling people, the brilliant paper. And I thought, oh, wow. And I submitted it to Phi Beta Kappa for a prize. I was tied for second place. And then I showed it to my father, and he said, take a look at Boas, the IJAL, the Boas Festschrift. And there was the same, almost the same as what I had done, but very much briefer. So, you see, I'd been a good student. I took his premises, and I had shown he was right. That he had just tossed off these intuitive ideas, and I had pretty much justified what he was doing. And I thought that was kind of a flaw in a teacher. He should have at least told me, hey, you take a look at my paper, or don't publish it because that's already been done, or something like that. So, but another anecdote about Jacobson that I'm quite fond of is that my father and he were contemporaries. At one time, my father was a late bloomer like me. He changed professions and was a graduate student. At the age of 50, he got his PhD. And Jacobson was the newly arrived star. But they had a lot of friends in common. They knew each other. And they would chit-chat. And my father said, oh, I'm so exhausted because I keep having to serve on an exam committee and on all kinds of chores, the library committee. How do you manage to have time for your work? And Jacobson said, easy, I never refuse. I just say, I would love to, but not now. And I thought that's a very good piece of advice for any of the future academics. I would love to, but not now.
I have a sort of a question about, were you ever, by the way, for those in the audience who haven't had the chance to read, as John and I have, the great biography which you wrote for your 50th reunion, I guess, at Radcliffe. You have a terrific trajectory coming from Russia to...
No, France. I was not in Russia till I was 50 years old.
Oh, really?
Yeah. My parents
you just
came
start...
to
Oh, I see. Okay. So, do you have the feeling that linguistics is were you in Russia long enough to have a feeling as to whether the way they do linguistics there and their foci, or what's important for Slavic linguists in Slavia, if you can say that, in the among the Slavic countries, is it different significantly than over here?
Yeah, well, under Soviet rule, it had to be what was approved of Soviet rule. And I think they are, they're very interested in trying to learn about the endangered languages that are disappearing.
Okay.
And for that, they have borrowed much more from the functionalist theories, where you say, how do you express a particular meaning? in this life. But then, you see, that means they're totally closed to things like extraction problems, because those are, you can't go from meaning to form. The meaning, they're not relevant there, except maybe having a noun phrase or topic movements, but you know, the extractions and complementation problems are not. And it's only recently that there's this guy, Testelets, he teaches syntax. He sent me this big book, which I confess I have not read, but I did write him a thank you note. And it's, you know, they said, well, we used to just smirk at this, but now there's something. But you see, they're way behind, and so they get no response from anybody here.
Yeah.
The functionalists are more likely to invite somebody to spend a term in Oregon or something like that. But you know, they are anybody who's a little far away is by definition behind and doesn't count.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think they care that much. When syntactic structures came out and Jacobson reappeared, you see, he'd been away. He finally came to Moscow for a big international meeting and gave his paper on the case cube. That was 1958. And in 1960, he read this Grammar of Poetry and Poetry of Grammar. And then cybernetics and information theory also were coming out then. And all of those things suddenly hit Russia. You see, Russia had, they had blacked out anything to do with formalism because it was politically incorrect for Marxists. And Jacobson had also not been, he'd been persona non grata, but then he was sort of rehabilitated. And then there was, you see, the Russians have usually much better training in math and computers and so on than our humanists. And so people were very excited about cybernetics and so on. And there was tremendous government support for conferences, salaries, and so on for people who develop a theory of literature that would be kind of deterministic. I mean, the government, I mean, the level of support, considering, you know, how things are in academia today, it was just extraordinary. And they were looking for a cybernetic poetics, et cetera, and then it just died. It didn't go anywhere. But all these people who were at these conferences made very good careers. And Jacobson, I mean, I was amazed to read that article that your friend sent from France, that Jacobson was very much influenced by information theory and cybernetics. I never heard him say a word about it, except for that Shifters has code and message. That's about it. And, you know, in that big fat book where that's the only article is your article on code and message, but you have a completely different approach to it. And I have a feeling that he was not influenced by those things. He was looking for some anchors when he came as a stranger to New York, and was, well, he was a good buddy. He enjoyed social life. He met a lot of interesting people. But I think his idea was more to discover how he had some of those ideas in Nietzsche before anybody else. And then they finally discovered. But I'm sure there will be people who would defend him to the death. And, I learned a lot from him. I'm not criticizing, but at the same time, it is not surprising that the book of reprints of his papers is this thick, I think 111 pages. And these contain several just 2-page things from Festschritz, and the 36 case paper and the cube paper in 1958, and also a verb paper from 1932 and shifters from 1957. Well, it shouldn't be surprising that years later, an 18-page paper is not definitive. But somehow, and there are Slavists who, some of our elders and betters, I don't have many anymore, who really say, you disagreeing with shifters? How can you? How can you permit yourself to disagree with shifters? And some of those, it's a strange phenomenon because over the years I've read a lot of Jacobson. I've done some work, and I learned a lot from him. But then you reread something like Scene Zero, and there's only, say, about 4 lines about syntax, but it had grown in my memory as Jacobson's only paper on syntax. But it's only like 10% or less. Well, what's smaller than 10%? 5% or less. And the same with the so-called Bulgarian evidential. There is one sentence with one example in shifters, but somehow it's been cited as authority when it's not even clear whether he means evidential or non-evidential. It's just an example that I think he put in because he had an empty spot in his matrix and he had to fit something in there. And it's just a phenomenon, just sociologically and historically, how he managed to build this mystique.
What did he think about the rise of generative grammar and Chomsky's way of doing syntax? You were doing it, and how did he feel about what you were doing?
Well,
other people were doing?
Chomsky had very little contact with him. I met him at some parties when I first came, and in fact, Skinner was at one of those parties, and as we were going out, Chomsky was saying to Carol, I kind of like him.
Did he give him a cookie at that point?
Well, I think when I was teaching language 4 days a week, correcting millions of papers, that was when enrollments were high, and but then we had this very nice lady, Mrs. Freeman, who died at just short of her 100th birthday just last year. She would have great big parties at her house in Belmont, and the Chomskys and the Hellers and everybody would be invited. And on Friday, I was so tired that I think I did not make intelligent conversation. I would ask people, the same person 3 times how many children they had, or something like that. And so, and I think he never liked me particularly, and some people said, well, you should send Chomsky a paper. Well, I sent him the paper in which I had a modification of A over A and a bit of evidence from language acquisition that seemed to fit. He never acknowledged it. And just recently, though, well, 2 years ago, my former student, Gil Rappaport, who is a professor of Slavic linguistics at Texas, Austin, he came to Cambridge, and he wanted to see Morris. I called Morris, would you like to come over, say hello to Gil? And Morris came, on dérangeur. Il s'est dérangé, which was very nice, and he came. And Gil said he'd said something to Chomsky, and Chomsky had answered. And Morris said, oh, Chomsky answers everybody, all the letters. And I said, well, he didn't answer me. Oh, well, he can't answer everybody. You know, some people, the more they open their mouth, the more trouble they get into.
People practice shooting, say, a half an hour a day for a week. And the third group of people thought about shooting for a half an hour. And while it was true that the people actually threw the ball in, the last two groups both improve. The group that does nothing doesn't improve, but the thinking about shooting foul throws and actually throwing foul throws, they come out close. And I think it's because of mirror neurons. You know, there are these neurons which fire whether you move a muscle or think about moving it or see somebody moving the muscle. Yeah. So.
Well, in that same book, it said that Glenn Gould, who plays these Mozart sonatas at breakneck speed, that he used to practice that way, because you wonder, how could he ever practice? But he would be just lying in bed and thinking of where he was putting his fingers.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't his only way of practicing.
Folks, yes. Would you folks like to join the conversation?
What kind of linguistics do you do in Slavic?
Most of them have read you. Some of them have read your article on definiteness.
Oh.
Today.
I have a question about, you mentioned how much work you've done teaching Russian. What kind of approach did you find most effective? I mean, what's kind of your experience in teaching Russian? How do you do it? Is it more communicative? Do you focus on structure of Russian?
Well, I focused more on structure because that was my interest, and I used Lipson's book, which is a parody of the Soviet thing, so it's not really suitable today. But I was very fond of it because it got people a good idea of the system, the grammar, with a small vocabulary, and then any new vocabulary you learned would fit into some category you already knew. I also taught some from Stillman and Harkins, which was a very boring book, but then it gave me a chance to be more funny and so on. It's very, my teaching did not feed into my research. There's just that one A/A paper when some students made an interesting remark about a construction. And the number of insights I might get from the mistakes my students make in their homework quickly approached zero. And so I liked the students. I had smart students who were they wanted to learn Russian. Some of them were remarkably good. But I didn't have any real pedagogical theory. It was a way for me to support my research. And I did, I taught successfully, and some of my students went on in linguistics, like Gil and and some of the linguistic students took Russian, like Aronoff and McCarthy and Jean Roger. He wrote a brilliant essay on Domik na Balote.
Who is that?
It's a little spy novel that you read in second-year Russian,
I see.
and it's really bad written. But he wrote. It starts with, "I don't remember my mother. She died when I was only a year old or something." And so he said, "This shows incestuous a problem in this cast of characters and so on." And it was just a wonderful parody of some of the criticism that we get. But I found that when I was younger, I was good at getting the kids to talk. I don't go along too much with the communicative view that says you don't need grammar, and I don't like teaching that way. However, I think that teaching grammar without talking enough is bad too. But I was quite good at, getting students to talk to each other, or jollying them into saying I could make up interesting exercises. But then, as I got older, and there was no good second-year textbook, and that's one of the problems. You can't write a textbook, because if you write a textbook, you'll never get tenure, and you'll be selling fries at McDonald's. But if you but then you have to make do with bad textbooks, and then I would write handouts, and I got so that I liked writing handouts more than teaching. And when I was a visiting professor in France, that sort of opened my eyes. This is what I've been missing. Not a single paper to correct, nothing. I could just talk about my work for 3 hours once a week. And then I had a computer on which I wrote my examples and the translations, and everybody was nice to me, even though my French is sort of arrested in childhood, but I have a good accent, so and everybody in the audience was either that spoke English or a Slavic language or both. So, but when I came back to MIT and having to teach from a lousy book and fighting for every cent for the part-time lecturer and all this, I thought it's time for me to retire. So I retired the next year.
But let me ask you, you're talking about, and I know this well, you teach language all week, you're exhausted by Friday, and language teaching is fun for a while, and you're right, you can jump around and be funny, but it's not intellectually stimulating. Here we've got your selected essays. Your work is on every graduate reading list in Slavic linguistics. How did you maintain an intellectual edge? But in addition to, there's two questions. How did you maintain productivity? But how did you maintain, really cutting-edge research, really important research?
I think one advantage is not being young and single. So I, I didn't have the problem of being young, and I had a husband who didn't need to be entertained. He sang in a couple of choirs. He liked to play cards. He collected stamps. He had a demanding job. So he was just as happy if I was busy reading all the CLS volumes from cover to cover, and also I think I would not have been able to manage. My first salary was $7,000 a year at MIT, and if I'd had to choose, do I go to at sale in New York to read a paper, or do I buy shoes for the kids? Then I would not have made it. But this way, my husband was buying the shoes for the kids, and I did go to these conferences, and going to conferences does give you visibility. And you also have to be proactive. You know, I said, oh, I could give this paper, and then I look and say the deadline was 2 months ago. But then I sent it anyway. The worst they can say is no. And it turned out that somebody had pooped out. Anyway, there was room, and they invited me. And then somebody heard me at that paper and asked me to be on some other panel. And that other panel was in Montreal. And another thing that I found quite instructive is that when you are working on something and get it really finished, like the first chapter of your thesis that, you know, been in the works for 3 years or more, then, and you give a talk about it, and you say, this must be so boring. How can anybody stand it? But that's the stuff that goes over really well, because you're comfortable with it, you do it. The next year, I changed some things and worked in a different framework, and I talked too fast because I wanted to fit it into the 20 minutes, and there were no questions and so on, and I felt, well, this is a B- kind of performance. So, I think it does pay to go to conferences. The other thing too is that there is that syndrome of the elders and betters intimidating you. You know, now I look back and say, you know, who are these people? Who were they? Now I forgot where I was going here.
The elders intimidating, probably not being intimidating.
Oh, yeah. That if I went to just as a plain dirty old graduate student, to at sale, I would be hesitant about approaching some important person, introducing myself. And one time I came to the hotel early, and there was nothing going on in Slavic, but there was a reception for the teachers of French. And I signed up, you know, I know French. And we did teach, though I didn't, scientific French in our section, so I went in. And because I had no worries or felt any feeling of low status there, I chit-chatted with them, and none offered me a job in some Catholic college. And well, you know, just if you just go in and not look bashful, it really pays.
I have a question. Since there are a number of places in your biography where you talk about people who seem to be, about women who did not get the same opportunity as men doing similar work and so on. Is it your impression that there has been significant change, or only sort of token change?
I think it's a significant change, and change within the women, because one of when I was in graduate school, I never expected to be a professor, because women were not professors. And so I thought I would work for some admirable man. God forgive me, but yeah. And then it wasn't until I say, hey, these guys in graduate school who were, you know, they're no better than I am, and they're becoming professors. And one thing, my mother-in-law was secretary of the Slavic department, and she was, that's how I met my husband. She told him that my father had a daughter. And so she was very discreet and never said anything. But after she died, I found a couple of letters of recommendation that had been written about me. And one of them was by Lunt, saying, "Oh, Mrs. Chvany is very cultured, very good student, and I don't expect her to become a publishing scholar, but she would be a fine teacher." Now, he'd never seen me teach. It's just that I'm a woman and a mommy, and I'd probably be a good teacher. But, I could have been eating the students alive. But and then I wondered, why did my mother-in-law nag me about publishing? And it was because of that letter. And it was for a fellowship. And in the same batch, for the same fellowship, Joe Van Kampen wrote about me. And he wrote, well, she is unusual in that she has shown in her undergraduate thesis that she could do publishable work. The only thing I can say against her is that she is the mother of 3 children and would not be able to devote as much time to her career as a man. And yet, what happened to him? He's done zilch since we left. But injustices even out. I was so fortunate to be with that group that came to America, to be placed with a wonderful family, and I have had a very nice family, so I feel a little bit of sexism. I mean, some of it I felt very bad about, but but when I think of, say, Morris Halley, he's a man of his generation. He's an East European, and on the whole, I am more grateful to him than I am angry, because he helped me at the time that I was teaching my huge teaching load, and I was trying to write my thesis. He made time for me to come every Tuesday afternoon and tell him what I was doing. He never read anything, but he had me tell him what I was doing. And then he said, "Hey, you have a thesis." Then it took me, I wrote it, and then it was this long. And then he said, "Oh, it doesn't swing," because I'd written it in order of discovery, rather than, which is what everybody does. And then you're supposed to have your conclusion first, and then say how wrong all the other people are, or the other ideas are. And but he was very good to me, and he can't help it. He's a man of his generation. And the other thing, which I will confess, that I think turned him or frightened him away from me or something, is that shortly after my father died, I hadn't had a chance to fight out certain things with my father, who was an East European, and Morris gave me a hard time about my an early draft of my B book, and I got very upset, and I got angry, and I cried, and that's never cry, but because it was partly that he reminded me of my East European father and the things I hadn't had a chance to fight out with him. And so I could see now he'd be afraid to say anything to me because I might have a tantrum or something. But that was 30 years ago, 40.
Maybe it's a good time to wrap up.
Yeah. Well, Katja, I think all of us are privileged to have a look at a life of a very happy, on the whole, as you say. Can we put, well, is it all right with you if we put your biography on some website where people could look at it if they'd like to? Would that be all right with you?
Okay, if you identify it as part of a reunion, a college reunion thing. See, I have my little Ratcliffe tree here.
Good. Because you were part of a very turbulent time, in not only because of the war and your sort of your difficult escape from Europe and your fortunate landing in good hands here, and you're being, as Lenore said, a mom, and teaching huge sections and stuff like that, and still writing cutting edge stuff.
Well, I think MIT helped me a lot. Just the example of MIT, that if you're at MIT, you have to be productive, you have to do interesting stuff, and so on.
Yeah,
So if I'd stayed, say, at Wellesley, I would have done some stuff, but not nearly as much.
that's right. There's that saying, don't look back, they may be gaining on you. That's definitely what you feel at MIT,
Yeah.
as all three of us know, because we've all done.
And
done
it's very
time.
seldom that they say well done or anything like that. You won the Nobel Prize. What took you so long?
Well, it's John and I have been talking about this idea of ours of bringing people who've played a role and who have thought about language for a long time, and to make it possible for us to see the faces and the way of holding oneself, which glues together for me certainly, and I think for everybody. I wish that when I was a student, people had, I wish I could have seen, I wish people who had, for instance, one of my teachers, a huge influence with me was Zelig Harris, who was a student of Edward Sapir. Edward Sapir is certainly one of the greatest linguists of the 20th century, but Harris never said anything about what Sapir was like as a person. We know about his ideas, we can read his ideas. I think it's very, very important. It certainly was important to me, and I think it will be a huge, I'm hoping that this sort of initial period while we're figuring out how to do this will survive, and that this will get some momentum, because what you've given us today is terrific, and we're so glad you could come. And
Well, I'm glad to be invited. Invite me again.